Hi, my name is Alvin Alexander, and this is my Introduction to Functional Programming video course. This course is going to be heavily based on my book, Learn Functional Programming the Fast Way, and I'm going to start this introduction with one or two chapters from the book. Also, even though this course is heavily based on the book, there's no reason to buy the book, but if you are interested in it, I've made the PDF version of the book available to you for just $5 if you use the link shown and then the special promotion code that's also shown right here. To get started with the introduction, I just want to talk about the book for a few moments. So, as I note here, my initial plan on creating the book was I wanted to create a small little booklet, and I was going to call it something like Thinking with Types or Becoming a Type Ninja. And then as I started working on it more, I thought, really what I want to call it is something like Solving Problems with Pure Functions. And that's because I wanted to show how you can write really solid and maintainable code just using these programming techniques. So, pure functions, immutable variables, which I call algebraic variables, immutable data types, and if you're familiar with Java and Kotlin, you can think of the string type, and in Scala you can also think of types like list and the immutable map and other immutable collections types. And then also expression-oriented programming and also functional error handling. And then as I started working on the outline and the examples, I realized how close I really was to writing just pure functional programming code. Because if you're using these techniques right here, you're basically really close to just writing pure FP code as long as you have the right libraries to work with while you're doing that. So at that point, I switched from trying to write a booklet about solving problems with pure functions, and I decided to write a book on functional programming. And my initial goal was to try to write the book in about 200 pages. That grew to 250 pages, but part of that is because I use some examples at the end, and I actually go kind of thoroughly into some examples, and then I show how to use Zio at the end of the book, or at least how to get started with Zio. And that's an important point about the book and about this course, is that when you're finished with this course, I want you to be able to look at the Zio or a Cats Effect websites, their documentation, and think, oh yeah, I know what they're doing, and I know why they're doing it. And to me, that's often the biggest hurdle, because once you get through these points right here, the rest of it is just learning the specifics about how to use each library. Another important point for me is that when you write a book, you want to say, who is this book for? And in this case, who is this video course for? And what I mean by that, for example, is if you're an experienced functional programmer, this course is not going to be for you. I don't get into any brand new topics about functional programming. But what I do is I try to explain functional programming in a simple way for object-oriented programmers. But really, it's for anyone who's interested in these programming techniques up here. If you haven't used them before, this is for you. And if you're just starting to work with those concepts, as I note, this is for you. Or if you've gotten into functional programming a little bit and you find it hopelessly confusing, I really hope this is for you because I try to simplify it as much as I can. And it's also for anyone who might be interested in improving their code. So you might improve your code with the techniques that I show here. And by that, anytime I talk about improving code, I'm talking about making it more readable and more maintainable, also more testable. And as we go through this course, I'll show what I mean by improving your code. Another key point down here is that all of these examples are going to be written using Scala 3, but I don't use any what I call Scala magic tricks right here. The code is written in a really simple style, and you'll see that soon. And maybe the only difference is that you see the types a lot, you see the data types. And again, you'll see what that means as we go along. Now, as for what I assume that you know, it will definitely help if you know a little bit about Scala, but if you don't, I include a cheat sheet in the back of the book here, and I have a cheat sheet on my website. But as a practical matter, the basics of Scala are really straightforward. And again, as I write the code, I think you'll see that. So if you've used other languages like these that I have listed here, or Rust or C, for some reason I skipped C right there, I think you'll pick up what I'm doing very quickly. The key part here is that the Scala 3 book is free on the official Scala website. So I wrote most of the initial version of that, and that's a completely free online version of a book. And also within that book, I wrote these chapters right here. So Scala for Java developers, Scala for Python, and Scala for JavaScript developers. So I wrote the initial versions of those pages. I'm sure they've grown a lot since then, but if you do use one of these languages, there's some nice comparisons between the two languages on these pages. One thing I want to say is, as a word of caution before we get started, and I got caught up in this myself, and that's why I really want to stress this here, is that when you write small applications using functional programming, it's like the techniques that you use almost seem like overkill because your code is a little bit more verbose and you're running, wow, why in the world would I go through these techniques when it's so easy to write procedural code, as an example. And so you might dismiss functional programming right away. But I encourage you not to do that because what happens is when you write large applications on teams with other developers, you're going to be extremely grateful for those same techniques. And what I mean by this is that you'll be able to look at the functions written by other developers. And as long as those functions are pure functions, you'll be able to just look at their type signatures and go, aha, I know what that function is doing. And another key point is that when you're using functional programming, you don't have to worry about the state of the entire application. Like in object-oriented programming, there's usually some mutable global state that you're working with, and that just doesn't exist in functional programming. So the only thing you have to worry about is the function that you're currently writing, the data that comes in, and whatever data you're going to return along with your algorithm. And there'll also be lessons on this as we go along, especially when I talk about pure functions. So at this moment, I just want to say I'm trying to save you from looking at functional programming and thinking the techniques are overkill, because that's what I did initially, and it's really a wrong way of thinking. It's just the way things work, as I say, when you go from small applications to large applications. And there's kind of a funny analogy here, is way back in the day, Pepsi Cola, came out with some commercials. And they said, oh, we did these small taste tests and people preferred Pepsi over Coke. And what happened was people preferred Pepsi because it was sweeter. So in really small samples, that was a good thing. But then what happens in the real world, as we go from small applications to large, what happens in the real world is that Pepsi was actually too sweet to drink a large glass of. So in the real world, people preferred Coke because it wasn't as sweet as Pepsi. So again, that's a comparison between something that works well in a small sense, doesn't necessarily work well in the large sense. And in the case of FP, it's actually similar to that, where FP seems a little complicated in the small world, but when you get into large applications, you're going to go, oh my God, I am so glad we have these techniques that I didn't like in the small world. But again, I'll show more of that as we go along. The last thing I want to talk about in this introduction is that we're going to have a few technical terms that I'm going to use. And so I have those here, and one of the first things I'll talk about are these pure functions. So we'll talk about pure functions. We will talk about expression-oriented programming. Even though that's not very hard, it just means we're going to be programming with expressions rather than statements, as I note there, but I will have a short video on that. And another important one is when you say immutable variables, it sounds like an oxymoron, but it just means that we're going to be talking about variables in the algebraic sense. So there's also going to be a short video on that as well. Then there's some other terms here, and I'll explain those as we go along. And then the very last part of this welcome is that if you would like to work with the code as we're going along, you can find the code at this URL right here. And I'll try to stay as close to it as I can in this video series. But this video series is going to include this book, and it's probably going to go outside of this book as well. But just as a way of getting started, you can check out that code.